But on the near-death experiences, for example, I've read these too. I've known people who were deemed almost clinically dead, and then they've come back and they've told their stories and they've seen all sorts of things. But, you know, for example, a lot of us have wild, crazy dreams about stuff that never actually happened. I get a lot of deja vu, right, which is very random when it happens, but I think, again, that's just my brain playing tricks on me. Why should people's near-death memories, which they think have transported them elsewhere, not just be an extension of dreams and deja vu and everything else? In other words, not reality, but just something that the brain has tricked them into thinking.
Well, there are 4 reasons why near-death experiences point to survival of the mind after death that anyone who doubts them has to really account for. The first thing is that near-death experiences are very clear. They're very organized. They involve often a life review, which is not the kind of thing you see from a brain that is hallucinating, or a brain that is dying, a brain that lacks oxygen. The second thing is that about 20% of people with near-death experiences have out-of-body experiences, where they leave their body and they see things that are happening in the room during the time that they have no heartbeat. During the time that they are deeply unconscious and comatose because their brain isn't working. The third thing that fascinates me and isn't often mentioned is that I'm unaware of any reports in the medical literature of a person who goes down the proverbial tunnel and meets dead relatives who actually met a living person. That is, that all near-death experiences where you encounter people on the other side are people who are dead, even if you didn't know they were dead. There have been some fascinating cases of people in car accidents where somebody else in the car died. Somebody else has a near-death experience and the experiencer sees the dead person on the other side, but no one else in the car who lived. And the fourth reason is that near-death it's absolutely fascinating. There are several very well-documented examples of that. The fourth reason is that near-death experiences are often transformative. People are profoundly affected by this. There's a paradigmatic near-death experience that I call the Pam Reynolds challenge. Pam Reynolds was a woman who had an aneurysm at the base of her brain, who needed a special kind of neurosurgery. It was done in 1991 in Phoenix. And what they had to do is they had to stop her heart. They had to drain the blood out of her brain. They cooled her body temperature down to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And they had to repair the aneurysm. They had to open the artery at the base of her brain with no blood flowing. They monitored her brain to prove that she had no brain waves, she had no brainstem activity, and she had a near-death experience when she was proven to be basically clinically dead during the operation. She popped out of her body, went up to the ceiling, she watched the operation. She was able to describe the surgeon's instruments rather precisely afterwards. She described the conversations the surgeons had. She described who entered and left the room. She described the music that was playing. She went down a tunnel. She saw her dead relatives. It was a beautiful place, beautiful scene. She realized she had to return to raise her 3 children. She came back down the tunnel, went back into her body, and when she went back into her body, she said it felt like diving into ice water, because her body temperature was 60 degrees. So this is a very well-documented near-death experience. And there have been hundreds of people in the medical literature who have had experiences similar to that. So people who deny the reality of near-death experiences have to explain how Pam Reynolds saw the things she saw when all the blood was drained out of her brain during surgery.
Well, let's turn to you, Dr. Shermer. How do you explain this?
Well, a couple things. First, a clue is in the term near-death experiences. They're not actually dead. They're near death. And we know that there's lots of different things that happen under the trauma and stress of almost dying. We know from different lines of research, Dr. James Winery, a United States Air Force physician who accelerates pilots in a centrifuge until they black out, part of their training. Most of these pilot trainees get different kinds of out-of-body near-death experiences, not quite the same, but they have these dreamlet-like states where they feel like they're floating out of their body. Olaf Blanc, a neuroscientist that did research, neurosurgeon that did research on epileptic patients who had their heads open up and they had the corpus callosum split so they can stop the epileptic seizures from spreading. You wake up the patient and you tap around with an electrode, different areas of the temporal lobe. And he was able to produce near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences with this female patient, where he'd tap in one place and she goes, oh, I'm up by the ceiling now, I'm looking down. Tap another place, oh, my leg is now floating, my left arm is up, and so on. So we know that stimulation of the brain artificially produces symptoms very similar to the near-death and out-of-body experiences. You can turn to Oliver Sacks's various books in which lots of different weird, anomalous experiences happen under different conditions of stress or tumors or strokes and so on. Pretty much every chapter in all his books is something weird that happens to somebody under these different conditions. So there is an ongoing experiment now that would test the near-death experience. That is, they supposedly come out of the body and float up, and they look down and describe in great detail what's going on in the OR. Well, some scientists have placed up above on a top shelf facing up to the ceiling some numbers and letters and other symbols that if the person was actually really up there and looking down, that they would see these little test symbols and then report back later. And so far, no one has reported back anything like that.
Okay, but you've actually reminded me. You've reminded me of something that happened to me when I was young, which freaked me out at the time and has freaked me out, and I've remembered it because you triggered it. I was with a bunch of people in our teens, school friends and so on, and we did a makeshift Ouija board, right? Which obviously was a bit of a stupid thing to do, but we did it. And an extraordinary thing happened where one of the people was the girlfriend of one of the group, unknown to everybody else. The boyfriend, who we did know, was not involved, was watching from afar, not at the table. And as we conducted this makeshift Ouija board, it began to spell out very clearly and firmly, without her hand on it, or the boyfriend who wasn't involved at all, a name. And that name was the name of her father, who had died a few months before. And then it proceeded to have a conversation, including phraseology, that her father had used when he was alive. And again, nobody around that board knew the father, knew this girl, or anything else. The only person who knew anything was the boyfriend who wasn't involved. And it was a freakish thing to observe. And it was very, very precise and very accurate. And it reduced her to bursting into tears and leaving. How do you explain that kind of thing?
Well, the Ouija board is big fun. I've done it quite a few times. We know this is the ideomotor effect, in which idea motion, in which whatever you're thinking about very subtly moves the planchette on there. We know this from experiments in which the people are blindfolded and the planchette still moves. And so they're subtly moving it. They're not aware that they're moving it. Now, the next move where you get specific information, I've had this experience as well, very detailed, spelling out the names of lost loved ones and so on. But if somebody knows what it is, now you're claiming that the person not sitting there.
Nobody knew.
Fingers
That's
on
what
the
freaked me out.
planchette. Yeah. So I don't know. So here's a way to think about a lot of these stories, Piers, is that there's a what's called a residue of anomalies. That is, no scientific theory explains everything. This is true with UFOs and psychics and whatnot. There's always weird things that's left over. 90 to 95% of everything we can explain. There's another 5 or 10% we can't explain. It's good in that sense to keep an open mind just in case, but that 5% is not enough to tilt or tip scientists over into believing in the supernatural or the paranormal. And it's just okay to say, you know what, we can't explain everything and there's still a lot unknown. Let's keep an open mind.
Yeah, to a point, although it's the fact that we can't explain these things which makes me believe that claims like Dr. Egnall's making must have validity. Talking of which, you talk, Dr. Egnall, in your book about how people who have near-death experiences have something called terminal lucidity, where the patients nearing death become highly alert, often summoning their loved ones to say goodbye, often displaying an immense sense of peace. And you ask this question, is it, as a materialist might say, mere noise from a dying brain, or is it a signal intimating what lies beyond? Which I think is a fascinating question. Have you reached any conclusion about that?
Well, paradoxical lucidity or terminal lucidity is an experience that many people have, particularly people who are in the late stages of Alzheimer's, where they'll have an interval of 30 or 45 minutes where they're quite with it. They wake up, they talk with their family. Sometimes they're virtually normal, and then they slip back into a state of dementia. It's very, very well documented. It's actually fairly common. And that implies that there is some dissociation between the mind and the brain, at least transiently, in that instance. What I would also mention to Michael, he gave examples of stimulating the temporal lobe, et cetera, that can give an out-of-body experience. How, Michael, do you explain the hundreds of accurate perceptions by people who are having near-death experiences of the goings-on in the room when their brain had no circulation at all?
Yeah, that seems to me very compelling. I mean, Michael, what do you say to that?
We do have an explanation for that. That is, we are all relatively familiar with what ORs look like, for example, from television shows and documentaries and so on. So people have in their mind what they imagine that they're seeing, and then that is what gets reported later from memory of those experiences or those images that they have in their brain. I would also note that, again, to kind of tilt over into the afterlife, what is the soul that's supposedly floating out there? Now, a lot of you mentioned Piers transhumanists and the singularitarian people that want to live forever, the tech billionaires, right? So I know them, I've tracked them, I've written about them. They're materialists. They don't think there is a soul, so they need to preserve the body and keep going indefinitely, unless there's one more move that they make, is uploading the mind. So this would be where you copy every single synaptic connection between your neurons and have something that's called a connectome, kind of the analog of the genome, and you upload it into a file in the cloud somewhere. Now, we can't do this yet, but if you could do it, my claim is that that's not actually you. It's a copy of you, because if you did this while you were still alive, you'd still be sitting there, Piers, going, I'm not up there in the cloud, I'm right here. That's just a copy of Piers Morgan number 2, or whatever. So, but my point of this story is that Michael has the same problem of explaining how the soul, what is the soul exactly? Is it just a copy and your body is still rotting in the grave, or are you physically up there in heaven? And then one last point on the near-death experiences. Why is it then that Buddhists and Muslims and Jews do not see what Christians see when they have near-death experience? Christians often see Jesus and so on, Christian symbols. There's not a uniformity of what people see in the near-death experiences. They're very unique, and that leads us to think that the experiences are up here, not out there.